Welcome back, everybody. Ready to dive deep into a case that's both fascinating and, well, pretty dark.
Absolutely. This one has it all. And trust me, we're going way beyond the usual headlines.
The Black Dahlia.
Yeah.
It's one of those cases that just gets under your skin.
Yeah. And this time, we've got the good stuff. Declassified FBI memos, old newspaper articles, even those creepy anonymous letters.
We're talking primary sources here, folks. The real deal.
And yeah, we'll even be looking at Elizabeth Short's actual death certificate.
So what are we waiting for? Let's set the scene. It's
Yeah.
January 15th, 1947, in Limert Park, Los Angeles. A woman's walking with her little kid when they stumble upon something horrifying.
And it wasn't just that she was found murdered, it was the sheer brutality of it. Her body had been posed, cut in half at the waist, drained of blood. It's the stuff of nightmares, really.
Yeah, and those crime scene photos, we've seen them. They're hard to forget. The newspapers back then, especially the Herald Express, they didn't hold back.
No, they put it all out there and people ate it up.
Can you imagine the public reaction? I mean, this is before the internet, before cable news even.
It was a different time, but the case spread like wildfire.
The LAPD and the FBI, they both jumped on this case right away.
Oh, absolutely. This was big, even for them. And get this, they used this newfangled technology called sound photo to transmit Short's fingerprints all the way to D.C.
Sound photo. Sounds like something out of Star Trek.
Right. It was like an early version of a fax machine.
A fax machine in 1947, that's just wild.
It was cutting edge, I'm telling you. And because of that, they were able to identify her in 56 minutes.
No way.
Yeah, can you believe that?
That's unbelievable. Today we're talking DNA and facial recognition, but back then this sound photo thing, that was revolutionary.
Totally changed the game for criminal investigations.
It makes you wonder, though, if she hadn't been fingerprinted before, because of that army-based job and that underage drinking incident.
Ah, good point. It makes you wonder if it would have all played out so differently.
So we have a 22-year-old aspiring actress from Medford, Massachusetts, ends up murdered in Hollywood. Tragic, but not totally unheard of, sadly.
True, but the press, they needed a hook. And they found it, her nickname, the Black Dahlia.
Because she liked to wear black.
Right.
Supposedly. But even that detail is kind of murky, you know?
But it's stuck, that image, that name.
Oh, yeah. It's powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you're right. It's almost like we remember the nickname more than the actual woman.
It's a good reminder that there was a real person at the heart of all this, with a life and a story, and the way her own mother found out about her death. It's heartbreaking. The press, always hungry for a story, they told her Elizabeth had won some beauty contest.
Can you imagine? They used her grief to get a quote. Talk about a punch to the gut.
It's hard to even think about.
And, right from the start, investigators were struck by how the murder was carried out, the precision of the cuts, the way the blood had been drained. It pointed to someone with some knowledge of anatomy, maybe even medical training. Right. Like this wasn't some random act of violence. It was calculated, almost surgical.
Exactly. And that's just one of the many reasons why this case still fascinates us today.
It's easy to get lost in the gruesome details of a case like this.
It really is.
But we can't forget there's a real person at the heart of this, a young woman with her own story, Elizabeth Short. So tell me more about her life before Hollywood.
Yeah, her life before that final tragic chapter is actually full of twists and turns, almost like something out of a movie itself.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
So take us back to the beginning. She grows up in Medford, Massachusetts, right?
Right, one of 5 daughters.
5 daughters, wow.
Yeah, and they face their fair share of hardships, financial struggles, and to make matters worse, Elizabeth had these respiratory problems.
Oh, no.
So the family would send her to Florida during the winters, hoping the warmer weather would help.
That's tough being away from your family like that, especially as a young girl.
I know, right? It's kind of heartbreaking when you think about it. Anyway, it was actually in Florida while working as a waitress that she started to develop this sense of independence.
It makes sense.
And, even back then, she had this look, this presence that people noticed. In fact, the newspapers from the time really play up that angle, her looks.
Interesting. So that focus on her appearance, it kind of followed her to Hollywood.
Yeah, you could say that. But before Hollywood, there was this whole other chapter, this really intense love story. While she was in California, she spent some time at Camp Cook.
Camp Cook?
Yeah, and that's where she met and fell head over heels for this guy, Major Matt Gordon.
A major?
Yeah, he was in the military.
Wow. And what happened?
Well, they were crazy about each other, even got engaged. But then Tragedy struck. Gordon was killed in a plane crash before he could even return home from the war.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
Right. And it's just, well, talk about terrible timing. It was right before he was supposed to come home. Just devastating.
You have to wonder how something like that changes you.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about those anonymous letters, right?
The ones sent to the police.
Yeah, the ones we talked about earlier. Some of them actually included Elizabeth's personal belongings.
You're kidding. Like what?
Letters. Letters from Major Gordon.
Oh, wow.
He's like, the killer knew how important those letters were to her, you know?
Chilling.
Totally.
So after Gordon died, she eventually ends up in Los Angeles trying to make it as an actress. Did she have any luck?
Sadly, no. I mean, Hollywood's tough, you know? It chews people up and spits them out.
Yeah.
And she struggled, waitressing jobs, relying on friends, even spent some time living at the Hollywood Studio Club.
It's a studio club.
It was like a boarding house for aspiring actresses, a lot of them trying to make it big. The police reports from the time, they paint this picture of her as being incredibly vulnerable, especially in those last few months.
It's just
Yeah.
really sad. So we've got this young woman alone in Hollywood facing all these setbacks, and then she just vanishes.
Yeah, it's like she just stepped into thin air.
What do we know about that missing week between when she was last seen and when her body was found?
Honestly, not a lot. And that's what makes this whole thing even more frustrating. There were rumors, supposed sightings, but nothing concrete. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
We do know about a man named Red Manley.
Right? Red Manley.
He was the one who gave her a ride to L.A. and dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel.
Right. And he becomes a really important figure for the investigators. He's the last person to admit to seeing her alive.
And he cooperated with the police.
Oh, yeah, completely. He even helped them identify her purse and a shoe, which, get this, were found miles away from the crime scene.
Planted. It has to be, right? Like someone wanted them to be found.
It's hard to imagine it being anything else, but why? Was it a taunt, a distraction? And then there are those letters.
Don't even get me started on those letters.
Creepy.
The fact that someone was sending her stuff to the papers, claiming to be the killer?
It's like something straight out of a horror movie. Seriously. And they never figured out who sent them.
Nope. No fingerprints, no leads, nothing.
It's like the killer just vanished into thin air.
And you have to remember, at this point, the pressure on the LAPD is immense. They're getting calls nonstop. The media's all over them. It's chaotic.
More than 150 suspects.
At least. And a lot of them, completely bogus confessions, people just looking for their 15 minutes of fame.
It's hard to separate fact from fiction in a case like this, especially with the media frenzy surrounding it.
It's almost like the case itself became a kind of macabre entertainment.
And through it all, the question remains, who killed Elizabeth Short? One name that's come up a lot in recent years is Dr. George Hodel.
Right, Dr. Hodel. That's a whole rabbit hole in itself.
Fill us in. Who was this guy?
Well, he was a well-respected physician in L.A. at the time. But here's the thing. His own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective himself, he's convinced his father was the Black Dahlia killer.
His own son. That's intense.
Right, and he wrote a whole book about it, laying out his case, Black Dahlia Avenger. So what kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, Steve claims to have found photos among his father's things that look a lot like Elizabeth Short. And it gets even weirder. George Hodel, he was familiar with a surgical procedure, a hemicorporectomy.
Hemicorp what?
It's a procedure that involves basically cutting the body in half.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's the same method used on Short.
That's chilling.
It gets worse. They also found receipts for concrete, the same type of concrete that was found near Elizabeth Short's body.
Are you serious?
And get this, the LAPD had George Hodel under surveillance for a while, and they caught him on tape saying some pretty incriminating things.
Like what?
Like confessing to killing Short, and even possibly his secretary, whose death was originally ruled a suicide.
Wow. And they never arrested him.
By the time they realized what they had on those tapes, Hodel had already skipped town, left the country.
He got away with it.
Essentially, yeah. He was never formally charged, never faced trial.
So what happened? I mean, it's not every day that a case this big just goes cold.
Right. I mean, you've got FBI files, newspaper articles, witness statements, those letters, and yet the Black Dahlia case is still officially unsolved.
Unbelievable.
It's a reminder that sometimes, even with all the evidence in the world, some mysteries just might never be solved.
It makes you wonder if we're missing something, if there's some clue out there, some piece of the puzzle that could crack this case wide open.
Well, that's the thing about cold cases, isn't it? Sometimes all it takes is a fresh perspective, a new way of looking at the evidence.
And maybe, just maybe, someone listening right now will be the one to finally uncover the truth behind the Black Dahlia murder.
You never know.